How do you break a fortress that cannot be assaulted, cannot be undermined, and is surrounded by deadly marshes that swallow massive siege engines whole? In 1346, King Edward of England, having just annihilated what was thought to be the most invincible army in Europe, stood before exactly this nightmare. 99% of commanders in history would have taken their victory that day and gone home, but Edward did not. Instead of retreating or launching a suicidal assault, he built a brand new city from scratch, right outside the enemy's walls. This is the incredible story of the Siege of Calais, the operation that gave England a 200-year gateway into the continent, where a king waged war against nature itself out of pure defiance. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we are covering the Siege of Calais, the 11-month operation that turned a battlefield victory into a strategic transformation and gave England a foothold on the continent that would last for more than 2 centuries. But before we get to those walls, before we watch an entire English town rise from the marshes of northern France and a supply chain stretch across the Channel in the depths of winter, we need to understand why Calais mattered so enormously, and why taking it by force was never going to be possible. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. We cover the battles where British soldiers faced the impossible and found a way through. Don't miss them. Calais in 1346 was not simply a port. It was one of the most formidable fortified positions in northern Europe, and its geography made it almost uniquely resistant to conventional assault. The town sat behind double moats filled with seawater, its walls thick and high, its citadel in the northwest corner capable of independent defence even if the outer walls fell. Every gate was its own small fortress, with drawbridges, portcullises, and killing grounds designed to make any assault prohibitively costly. But the walls were almost secondary. The real defence of Calais was the ground beneath it. The town was ringed by marshes, soft, waterlogged terrain fed by the tides of the Channel, shifting and treacherous. Any attacking force that tried to approach with siege towers or heavy machinery would find the ground swallowing its equipment before it reached the walls. The engineering solutions that medieval armies used to take defended positions, tunnelling beneath the foundations, rolling towers against the battlements, were rendered useless by soil that could not bear weight. Calais could not be taken by storm. It could not be undermined. It had to be starved. Edward's garrison commander inside Calais was Jean de Vienne, experienced, clear-eyed, and fully aware of what was coming. The town had been provisioned before the English arrived. De Vienne's task was not to defeat the English in the field. It was to outlast them through winter and to wait for Philip VI to arrive with a relief army. Edward arrived on September 4th, 1346, assessed the situation, and made his decision. He was not leaving. What followed was one of the most remarkable feats of military logistics in the medieval period. The English army could not simply camp in tents and wait out an Artois winter. They needed shelter, food, warmth, and a supply chain capable of keeping tens of thousands of men fighting fit through months of cold and the particular misery of a siege that offered no action, no glory, and no prospect of quick resolution. Edward's answer was to build a town. The English constructed what contemporaries called Villeneuve-la-Hardie, the bold new town, on drier ground beyond the marshes. It was not a camp. It was a settlement, with timber-framed houses insulated against the weather, proper streets laid out in an organised grid, stables, administrative buildings, and a market that operated twice a week. Merchants came from England and Flanders to sell provisions, weapons, and equipment. At its peak, the population of Villeneuve-la-Hardie approached 30,000, larger than most English provincial cities of the period. Edward had not merely laid siege to Calais. He had planted a rival town outside its walls and dared the winter to move him. The supply operation required to sustain this force was extraordinary. Edward mobilised 853 ships and 24,000 sailors to maintain the sea lanes between England and Calais. Every necessity, food, timber, clothing, ammunition, horses, fodder, crossed the Channel in an unbroken stream. The English Parliament, exhausted after years of war expenditure, was persuaded to continue funding by Edward's personal commitment, He would not leave until the city fell. Queen Philippa herself crossed the Channel to join him in the camp. Her arrival told everyone who needed to know that Edward meant exactly what he said. The sea approach to Calais was the garrison's lifeline, and it took Edward months to close it. Genoese galleys under Carlo Grimaldi attacked English supply ships in the autumn of 1346, disrupting the blockade and raising the cost of the operation considerably. When the Genoese contracts expired and they returned home for winter, French privateers filled the gap. The most effective of them was Jean Marant of Boulogne, a mariner of exceptional ability who used his knowledge of the shallow coastal waters to run supplies through the English fleet under cover of darkness. Marant kept Calais alive through the first winter when nothing else could have. Edward responded with engineering. Old vessels were scuttled in the harbour mouth to restrict entry. The narrow sandspit controlling the harbour approach, the Reisbank, was seized and fortified, with artillery and archers positioned to cover the water. By the spring of 1347, the blockade had tightened to the point where meaningful resupply became nearly impossible. On June 25th, Marant made a final attempt with 30 ships. He was driven back. The sea was closed. Inside Calais, the consequences were becoming severe. Jean de Vienne had implemented the grim arithmetic of siege survival. Over the course of the operation, several thousand civilians, those who could not contribute to the defence, were expelled through the gates. In the early phases, Edward allowed them to pass through his lines, provided them with food, and sent them on their way. It was a deliberate act. Edward wanted the people of Calais to understand that their suffering was the consequence of Philip VI's absence, not of English policy. As the siege entered its final months, the situation inside the walls had become critical. De Vienne wrote to Philip VI in June 1347, stating plainly that food stocks were exhausted, and that unless relief came immediately, the garrison could not continue. The letter reached a king who was already assembling an army. Edward's artillery played a role that military historians have increasingly recognised as a turning point in European warfare. The English had deployed early artillery pieces at Crécy, and at Calais these guns were positioned on firmer ground beyond the marshes, elevated above the defensive range of French archers, and capable of projecting ordnance over the walls into the town's interior. The walls of Calais were tall, designed to prevent escalade, but that height made the streets and buildings behind them vulnerable to high-angle fire. The guns could not demolish the walls, but they could strike anywhere inside the city, maintaining constant pressure on the garrison and disrupting life in ways that no mechanical engine could have achieved from the same range. The experience at Calais contributed to a shift in thinking about fortification that would reshape military engineering across Europe. Tall walls became a liability rather than an asset against weapons that fired over them. The response, lower, thicker walls with earthwork bulwarks and angled projections, was the beginning of the architectural revolution that would eventually produce the star-shaped fortresses of the 16th century. Philip VI eventually assembled his relief force and marched north. By mid-July 1347, his army had reached the hills above Saint-Gate, within sight of Calais. From the walls, the garrison could see the French standards. After 11 months, France had come. Edward's preparations made the site irrelevant. Every approach to Calais had been fortified and held. The coastal route was covered by the English fleet. The inland approaches were blocked by entrenched positions manned by a combined English and Flemish force of close to 50,000 men. The ground Edward had chosen forced any attacker into exactly the situation that had destroyed the French at Crécy, approaching prepared positions across terrain that negated numerical advantage. Philip sent envoys to propose open battle on equal ground. Edward, holding every advantage, declined. Philip sent papal legates to negotiate. No terms could be found that gave France anything worth having. On the night of August 1st, the French army burned its camp and withdrew. When the smoke of the French departure was still visible from the walls, Jean de Vienne raised a flag of parley. Edward's initial terms were absolute. His commanders, Walter Manny chief among them, argued that such severity would harden future garrisons against negotiation. Edward offered a modified condition. The city would be spared if 6 of its leading citizens presented themselves to him personally, barefoot in rough tunics, with ropes at their necks, carrying the keys to the city and the castle. The announcement, read in the city square, produced the scene that Jean Froissart recorded in his chronicles, with the detail of a man who understood he was writing about something permanent. Silence. Then Eustache de Saint-Pierre, the wealthiest merchant in Calais, stepped forward and said he would go first. 5 others followed: Jean d'Aire, Jacques de Wissant, his brother Pierre de Wissant, Jean de Fienne, and Andrieux d'Andrés. They walked out through the gates as agreed. Modern scholarship has examined this scene with more precision than Froissart applied. The ritual was not a spontaneous confrontation with death. It was a structured ceremony of submission, a formal theatrical performance in which symbolic surrender of honour was understood by all parties to be the price of the city's survival. The 6 men were not walking to certain execution. They were performing a carefully negotiated ritual of royal authority, trading the appearance of absolute submission for the clemency that both sides expected to follow. Nevertheless, Froissart's account of what came next carries the texture of genuine drama. Edward, whose year-long commitment to the siege had accumulated real personal investment in the outcome, initially refused clemency. His commanders pressed him. Then Philippa, pregnant, present in the camp since the autumn, having shared the discomforts of the operation alongside the king, knelt before him and asked for the lives of the 6 men in the name of everything she had been through with him. Edward, by Froissart's account, told her he wished she had been elsewhere, but could not refuse her. The 6 men were released, given new clothes, given a meal, and sent back into the city they had walked out of an hour before. What followed the surrender was as deliberate as the siege itself. Edward's intention for Calais was transformation. The existing French population was largely displaced, their properties reallocated. Proclamations went out across England, offering extraordinary privileges to those willing to settle in Calais. Tax exemptions, guaranteed properties, trading rights, the legal status of an English borough transplanted to French soil. Within months, hundreds of English families had taken up the offer. Calais was being remade as an English town. The economic logic became clear within a generation. In 1363, Edward declared Calais a staple port, the mandatory passage point for all English wool exports to Europe. The Company of the Staple held a monopoly on this trade through Calais. Every bale of English wool crossing to the Flemish weavers who depended on it had to pass through the port, pay duties there, and be handled by licensed merchants. The customs revenues reached levels that would have been difficult to imagine before the siege. Over £112,000 in a single year during the 1350s, at a time when a knight's annual income was measured in dozens of pounds. Calais was not merely a military garrison, it was funding the English war effort in France. The Pale of Calais sent its own representatives to the English Parliament. It operated under English law. It was, in every practical sense, a piece of England on the wrong side of the Channel, an arrangement that suited English commercial and military interests so completely that it was maintained and defended for generations, regardless of the political upheavals that shook both kingdoms. Every major English expedition to France in the late 14th and 15th centuries passed through or was supported by Calais. Henry V used it as a staging post for the Agincourt campaign. The diplomatic relationship between England and Burgundy was partly maintained through it. The 100 Years' War was fought, in significant measure, from the foothold that Edward III had established, by refusing to accept that winter and marshes and stone walls were adequate reasons to go home. It fell in January 1558. The Duke of Guise brought a French army across terrain that English commanders had declared impassable in cold weather, moved faster than anyone in England believed possible, and took the town in 8 days. The appeals from the garrison did not reach London in time. When English reinforcements were finally organised, the port was gone. The loss produced one of the most quoted remarks attributed to any English monarch. Mary I, who died later that year, was said to have told those around her that when her chest was opened after her death, they would find the word Calais written on her heart. Whether she said it or not, the sentiment was accurate. The fall of Calais ended something that had begun in the marshes outside its walls in September 1346, when Edward III had looked at an impregnable port and concluded that patience, organisation, and absolute refusal to be moved were sufficient answers to any obstacle. He had been right for 211 years. Outside the town hall of Calais today, Auguste Rodin's 6 bronze figures stand where they have stood since 1895, barefoot, roped, carrying keys to a city that no longer belongs to England. They are among the most psychologically precise sculptures in Western art. Not triumphant, not heroic in any conventional sense, but present with the full weight of what it costs a person to walk towards something they cannot control. Rodin refused to place them on an elevated plinth. He wanted them at street level, where anyone passing could meet their eyes. Edward III stood where those keys were offered and understood, after 11 months, that he had done exactly what he had set out to do. The gate into France was open. If this is the kind of history that compels you, the operations built on patience rather than individual brilliance, the commanders who refused to accept that winter and weather and stone walls were adequate reasons to abandon a strategic objective, then you know what to do. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The battles that shaped a nation, told the way they deserve.